We're going to start off with the presentation by Dr. Salman Osfa about the evaluation. We'll follow that up with a short Q&A session. We're going to have to be a little bit flexible since we're also going to be joined by the GCF Secretariat at 11. So let's try and fit in both our Q&A, the presentation, and we'll have a short coffee break as well. That will be, hopefully we can get the coffees in here to speed things up a bit. So I'd like to invite Solomon to join us.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Claudia, for inviting us also to share the findings of the evaluation of readiness and the preparatory support program. We call it an IEU, Independent Evaluation Unit, try to make GCF faster, better, and smarter. The way we do that is by conducting a very rigorous evaluation and with the primary objective of learning and, of course, accountability. So this is a very massive document. It's about over 400 pages. You could access those documents now within the GCF board website to be considered for decision next week in Bahrain. So I'll give you a flavor of some of the emerging finding that comes from that report. So basically, the primary objective of the readiness evaluation is to assess the effectiveness with respect to fulfilling its intended objectives, also keeping in mind country ownership, and to review the approach that is used for implementing the program and kind of provide a recommended guide in terms of effectiveness, efficiency, country ownerships, and sustain impact. So for those of you guys who have been working with GCF readiness program, it has got 5 major outcomes: strengthening country capacity, engaging stakeholders in consultative process, supporting and realizing direct access, and providing access to finance, and then finally engaging private sector. Those are the 5 major outcomes of the readiness program. So generally, basically, if you look at the general portfolio, I'm not talking about country, this is a global portfolio. Overall, how GCF is operating, you don't need to look at the numbers, just looking at the number of countries receiving grants, the number of grants, the amount requested, amount dispersed. The key story that comes from the overall portfolio analysis is that up to mid-July 2018, about almost 52% that have been committed by the board, that's 190 million, has been committed, about half of that. From the 52% that was committed, about only 28% had been dispersed. So in terms of disbursement, still we are lagging behind, but this is the overall portfolio of the readiness program as of today, as of mid-July. So how did we do the evaluation? It's very quite rigorous and intensive exercise. Not only our unit who did the evaluation, we brought a firm from Canada who supported us with this evaluation. So we kind of developed a prospective new theory of change for the readiness program. We reviewed all relevant and key documents that are related to the readiness program in GCF. We have conducted multiple key informant interview. I think some of you who interviewed are here, like for instance Dennis, we have talked to him when he was in Songdo, and many others. We conducted focus group discussion. We provided online survey with NDS globally, about 40, and we conducted also country case studies in 9 countries, just to have an idea of selective countries' experience, just like you guys are doing here also. We did some in Latin America, in Paraguay, in Caribbean, Antigua and Barbuda, in Mongolia, in Kenya, in Senegal, in Namibia, in Bangladesh, and so on and so on. And in addition, also, we established a database within IEU by going all the readiness proposals and extracting qualitative information and putting into a database. And then finally, what we call a meta-analysis. That's a benchmarking exercise. We kind of compared GCF against 6 other global finance institutions and how readiness program is performing compared to other global finance. So for today, I would like to give you a very short presentation on the relevance of the readiness program on how it's doing on country ownership, its effectiveness and its efficiency, and finally give you also a short conclusion and recommendation. So the way I plan to present today's presentation, defining it that we kind of packaged what has worked so far and what has not worked so far, in terms of kind of condensing the message in a much more understandable way. So in terms of relevance, the key message that is coming out is that Readiness program compared to its global fund, the other GCF, adaptation fund, multilateral funds, and so on, it reflects a very greater ambition with a very good intention. And if we look at, you don't need to read the three, we compare across different global funds, especially in terms of supporting countries to access direct access project, in terms of engaging in consultative process, stakeholder consultation, and also in terms of the NAPS, supporting NAP program, GCF, the Readiness program is much more better in terms of that. And also, when you look at in terms of this design, and need, we find the Readiness program to be relevant, especially with respect to INDCs within the country, with respect to the NAMAs and the NAPs, even within the broader Sustainable Development Goals. We find the Readiness program to be quite relevant. What has not worked so well, I've discussed with some of you, is that, as you know, Readiness program at the stand kind of a much more homogeneous approach. It treats all country kind of homogeneously, this one-size-fits-all in quotation. What is interesting is about 24% of countries who are eligible to access the Readiness program, they do not access as of now. And there are a number of reasons why these countries don't access, why they don't participate, why they are not requesting the Readiness grants. We have a detailed description in the main report if you are interested. And so that kind of calls for GCF to think about its comparative advantage. Where is the niche for GCF within this global finance landscape? And also try to help to fill a capacity gap in terms of monitoring, in terms of reporting, and in terms of building a very high quality proposal, be it for the Readiness or the overall project proposal. So this in terms of the relevance, in terms of country ownership, what has been working so far is that when we review at the Readiness proposal that had been approved by the GCF, and we look at the proposal itself, there is a very good chunk of activities that are geared towards supporting NDAs, right? Strengthening NDAs and on. About 70% of the Readiness program have a component of NDA strengthening, which is a good thing by itself. We are not saying whether that is effective or translated into actual on the ground, but the fact that the activities are very widespread in the proposal is a good thing. And also there is a very good chunk of activities on coordination mechanism as a key activities within this proposal. And also finally, there is a very good coverage of activities in terms of helping countries engage in a stakeholder consultation. We find that to be much more a very good proxy in terms of country ownership. So what has not worked so far is, I think this is a fact, I mentioned in the other days, about 40% of countries who are accessing the Readiness grant as of mid-July, they don't have approved funded proposals. If the primary objective of the Readiness program is to support countries to develop a project proposal, and we observe about 40% of those who are accessing and they don't have a funding proposal, then that raises a question whether the Readiness program is fulfilling its intended objective. And also we find that the finance and the capacity building that is provided by the Readiness program is not sufficient for helping countries to develop pipeline, and that's one key major finding. And also there is a lot of heterogeneity across the different blocks of countries. The seats, LDC countries tend to request the list, especially for pipeline development. And also we find there is some tension within the different ministries in terms of managing the GCF readiness activities. Here, in most of the countries, the Ministry of Finance, but that is not a representative of the overall global portfolio. In many countries, there are also Ministry of Environment who are the focal point in some countries jointly, and often we find a tension in terms of ownership of that. Again, that's a factual thing. What has not worked is also, again, the vulnerable countries, which is the primary target of GCF. They show least effect in terms of strengthening NDS. So there is heterogeneous effect in terms of strengthening NDS. And so generally, when we look at even the GCF document, there is no clear definition of country ownership, how to measure country ownership. So we try to create a proxy to measure ownership, and we created for the 9 countries. We did a country case studies. So we measure country ownership in terms of the level of NDA strengthening within a country, whether there is a direct access entity within a country, whether there is a NAP, whether there is a country programming, whether there is stakeholder consultation, this kind of what we call a categorical indicator, and we created a proxy to measure, and we ranked those countries accordingly. As you could see, Paraguay within that proxy has a list in terms of this proxy of country ownership, while Bangladesh has the highest. I mean, we are not by any way implying that Readiness program is performing less in Paraguay and better in Bangladesh, but we try to kind of create a proxy to measure country ownership. But the key message that came out of that exercise is that the need to measure result better, right? The need to have a proper targeting, and the need to have an indicator on how you measure country ownership. And I think the Secretariat need to do a better job defining and measuring what country ownership entails. And again, I mentioned also the other days that we find the country programming to be very few. Generally, there is only 8 country programming that have been approved so far, and they tend to be very general and with a very weak climate rationale. And that's why we were kind of thinking whether country programming is the way to go. But I have the feeling from this audience yesterday that you have a very positive view of country programming. But this is something we need to further discuss with the Secretariat. And how can they do better? I mean, if it's important, then they need to kind of strengthen, help countries with very strong purpose and a strong climate rationale. And then that would translate into project ideas and concept notes and proposals. So effectiveness. How is Readiness program doing in terms of its effectiveness and what is working so far? I don't want you to read the number. Is that the key story that is coming from Readiness program in terms of effectiveness is that the structural dialogue that was supported by the Readiness program in terms of to exchange information is working pretty well. The GCF organized a number of structural dialogue across the different regions, and we find that to be quite effective. And that is something GCF should strengthen and going forward scale up and do more. But what has not worked so well is that, again, like you guys also know, I think we felt from most of the countries we visited that Readiness program tend to be disproportionately resource and time intensive compared to the amount of resource that the countries are receiving. And also, it is very less effective in terms of supporting direct access entities through basic and upgraded accreditation. For most of the countries, particularly in the states, small island developing states who have direct access entities, it's not because of the Readiness program, but because of the prior support they have been getting, either from Adaptation Fund or from GCF and so on and so on. So if the primary objective of the Readiness program is to support direct access, then they need to do a better job with that respect. And because of that, then most countries, they prefer international accredited entities, which is not the preferred option for GCF. Like yesterday, she noted about, I think there's a big, in terms of the long-term vision, I think GCF would like to engage a lot of direct access entities, which is directly linked with country ownership, directly channeling the resource to the countries, either through government, but also NGOs and other private local actors and so on. But Readiness so far is doing not that good. Again, also, we discussed yesterday in terms of the private sector. I think that's one of the glaring kind of limitation of the Readiness program, is that it has limited impact in terms of crowding in private sector investment. And the reason is that the private sector needs and the cycles and the pace, they are not appropriately matched with the GCF kind of mindset and how they engage with the private sector, just the way we discussed yesterday. And for me, when I was listening yesterday, some of the discussions, so I look at the discussion and kind of cross-reference with the finding we got from this evaluation, and there is a lot of validation to that. In terms of efficiency, that's the last criteria I took today. How efficient is Readiness program, right? So that is, we kind of then looked at our internal GCF secretariat and how are they doing generally in terms of their implementing this program. So one of the things we did is what we call time-lapse analysis. The time, for instance, one of the proxy we used is the time it took from submission to endorsement, and from endorsement to approval, and from approval to effectiveness, and from effectiveness to first disbursement. How long did it take for GCF to process those grants? I think if you look at across the years from 2005 to 2007, I think one thing that that in 2015, it took about over 400 days from submission until disbursement of the first fund. But if you look at 2017, and that number reduced into 172. That's a massive reduction. So that's something the GCF secretary need to be congratulated, but there could be many reasons why the number decreased, but still they could do better in terms of having much more efficient in terms of processing those proposals. And one of the things that is contributing to this one is also what we call this framework agreement. For most of the accredited entities with the framework agreements, the number is much more slower. So there is much more fast processing time, and so which kind of signals to the importance of having a framework agreement with accredited entities. I'm sorry, I'm rushing a little bit, going quickly because there's a lot of information and we don't have a lot of time. But when you look at the different blocks in terms of the number of time it's required for processing, again we observed heterogeneity. For the seeds, it took a longer time, the longest time, while for LDCs, it took the least time, and that applies also to Latin American countries and Asia Pacific. For Latin America, it took about 350 days, for Asia Pacific, 251 days. I mean, the numbers by themselves, they don't say a lot, but the key story that come out of this is that there is heterogeneity across the different blocks, and then the question is why and what needs to be done to address that. So, and again, also from a GCF secretariat, most of the countries we observed, they pointed out that there is a lack of standard operating procedure, and turnaround times are not predictable often, and that's kind of affecting the efficiency of the program, and that requires attention from the secretariat as well. And again, also the legal process of this thing is noted as one major bottleneck for the process. So generally, we discussed with some of you the other days also about this regional presence, right? GCF operates from Songdo, and we don't have a country office. There are some regional advisors within the different region. Those are like the interface between GCF and the countries. So how are these regional advisors operating? I think there's a number of issues that need to be improved. Often these regional advisors are not up to date with the policy change that's going on within GCF. They cannot deal with international accredited entities and so on. So the key message is that the secretary need to do a better job in terms of supporting these regional advisors or associate professional or country program specialists to engage with countries and also accredited entities. And generally, this high transaction cost that's associated with dealing with the different institution is kind of creating inconsistent guidance, and also which is attributed to the delayed in grant. So I think I'm doing well with my time, and if there are questions, I could respond to that, but it's kind of rapid going. So the key conclusion is that generally, in terms of relevance and efficiency, we find the Readiness program to have done well, right? But there need to be still a work that need to be done in terms of managing country ownership and for country needs and about rethinking the country programming, right? That's one of the key findings and conclusion that come from the evaluation. And also in terms of effectiveness, we pointed out that there is a disproportionate time and effort. That means there is high entry cost for most of the countries, and that need to be addressed. And there need to be the focus on direct access entities is not yielding results so far. So what need to be done? Shall GCF kind of abandon the idea of direct access, or they need to have a different strategy that need to be looked at it? And also there's no kind of correlation between the Readiness program and pipeline development, right? I'm an economist. I do a lot of quantitative modeling exercise, and I care a lot about either correlation or causality, whether the Readiness program is causing pipeline development and so on. We don't see very strong, forget about causality, but we don't see any strong correlation generally. So that kind of need to be looked at it. And the private sector focus is a well-intentioned one, but so far very limited result. And they need to think about that also, how to do that. So generally, so what they need to do going forward, so the three key kind of thing that came out for us, discussing with many key stakeholders, is just generally, when you talk about readiness, the question is ready for what? Yeah, that ready for accessing climate finance, that ready for accessing GCF finance, that ready for what? That need to be well defined, right? And how do you know when the countries are ready, right? This is the issue I raised the other days. And how do we know? What are the yardsticks to measure the readiness of the country? And this goes to the three major issue within the readiness country programming division within the Secretariat. The first one is to have a vision. And the second one is to put at the target, and then managing and measuring result. Those are, I mean, it looks like a very simple kind of message, but it's very fundamental for the Readiness program within the GCF. So this is my last slide. So in terms of the vision, like I said, they need to redefine a strategy for global versus GCF climate finance and enabling environment. I think that need to come across very well. It's my understanding from this audience yesterday also that you kind of prefer the Readiness to be focused on the broader climate finance instead of GCF finance, I think, which is a good thing, but the GCF need to articulate that in terms of their strategy, what is the vision. That's a very important one. As of today, they don't have that. There's no clear vision in terms of that. And then the second one is defining niche and comparative advantage of the Readiness program, right? There are many actors in this field, bilateral, multilateral agencies working on that. So what is the comparative advantage of GCF in terms of in this field? And they need to have that target and niche approach. And then the third one that we care, especially in the evaluation unit, is that how do we measure that, right? To measure, then you need to have a target, you need to have proper indicator, and then how do we measure the impact of the program at the end? So far, there's no clear indicators, target, and how you could measure the effectiveness or efficiency of the Readiness program. So what we are suggesting is that we kind of did some sort of scenario analysis, right? We do have a lot of recommendations in the main report, but often the recommendations are kind of too long and it's very difficult to kind of implement. So we kind of package those recommendations and we provided different scenarios depending on the resource that is available, in terms of the expertise that's available and so on. And I think one of the key thing that came out is the approach of segmentation, right? This one size fit doesn't work. So we need to kind of think in terms of segmentation. And you could imagine some countries which requires hand-holding in countries with low capacity, and one could think about for those countries, I could imagine, for instance, like in many African countries, also in Asian, you could provide them with a readiness program, but at low entry cost, right? You could allow them to access the fund quickly, but then you should invest more in terms of demonstration and reporting. Need more extensive follow-up and monitoring and reporting and so on. Those could be one cluster of countries readiness could support, and the other countries could be those who doesn't need hand-holding, which have the capacity. That's what I'm talking about. India and Brazil, those with the capacity, they could run the program for them. You just need to figure out how to select them, but once you provide the finance, you don't need to monitor them frequently, and so on. I mean, this is an idea the Secretariat need to think going forward. This is what we call this Readiness Program version 2. And we have a detailed description of this recommendation in the report for those of you who are interested. I think I'll wrap it up there, and thank you very much.